In the sun-baked courthouse of San Miguel, Judge Horus Bradock's cruel auction was about to change 3 broken lives forever. When the gavel fell and a grieving rancher shocked the jeering crowd by choosing the rejected Amish woman, nobody could have predicted the empire of love, justice, and redemption that would rise from that moment of impossible mercy. Welcome to a story that will take you from the dusty streets of frontier justice to the soaring peaks of human triumph. Stay with us until the very end. This tale gets more powerful with every twist. And comment below with your city so we can see how far this story of hope has traveled across the world. The merciless August sun beat down on San Miguel's courthouse square like the judgment of an angry god, casting harsh shadows that seemed to carve the faces of the gathered crowd into masks of cruel anticipation. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, stirred by the restless shuffling of boots and the occasional snort of horses tied to weathered hitching posts. The air hung thick with the scent of sweat leather and something else, the bitter tang of human desperation. Judge Horus Bradock stood on the courthouse steps like a vulture surveying carrion, his black robes flapping in the hot breeze. His pale eyes cold as winter stars surveyed the assembly with undisguised contempt. At 52, Bradock had presided over this backwater town for nearly 2 decades, and in that time he had perfected the art of legal cruelty. His thin lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile, though it held all the warmth of a snake's kiss. "Ladies and gentlemen of San Miguel," Bradock's voice rang out across the square, carrying the authority of law and the poison of prejudice. "We gather today for a most charitable endeavor." The crowd tittered with nervous laughter. They knew what was coming. Word had spread through the town like wildfire. The judge was holding another of his infamous debt auctions, where the poor and desperate were bartered away like livestock to settle their obligations to the state. These fine women, Bradock gestured with theatrical grandeur toward a small group of figures huddled in the shadow of the courthouse, find themselves in circumstances most unfortunate. Debts, unpaid families unable to support them. Reputation, shall we say, tarnished beyond repair. Among the cluster of women, one figure stood apart, not by choice but by the cruel mathematics of social rejection. Abigail Yodar was 26 years old, though the hardships of her life had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of decades more. Her simple brown dress, sewn in the modest style of the Amish, hung loose around her substantial frame. Her prayer cap sat perfectly straight. On her auburn hair, a small act of defiance in maintaining her dignity despite the circumstances. Abby's hands, calloused from years of honest work, clutched a small leather satchel that contained everything she owned in the world. Her blue eyes, bright as summer sky, but shadowed with pain, stared straight ahead. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. "The terms are simple," Bradock continued, his voice carrying easily across the packed square. "Gentlemen may bid for the privilege of marriage to these ladies. The winning bidder assumes all debts and obligations. Consider it an investment in companionship." The crowd roared with laughter at this crude joke. Women whispered behind their fans, their voices sharp with gossip and judgment. Men elbowed each other, making crude comments about the merchandise on display. In the back of the crowd, near a wagon loaded with supplies, stood Louis Boon. At 34, he was still a handsome man, though grief had carved deep lines around his dark eyes and streaked his black hair with premature silver. His clothes, while clean, showed the wear of a man who worked with his hands, a rancher whose life had been consumed by labor and loss. Louis had come to town for supplies, not for this grotesque spectacle, but something had rooted him to this spot, some invisible force that he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the memory of his beloved Sarah, dead these past 3 years from consumption, who had always possessed a fierce sense of justice. Perhaps it was the way the Amish woman held herself, proud despite her circumstances, unbroken despite the world's cruel attempts to crush her spirit. "Let's begin with this charming specimen." Braddock's voice cut through Louis's thoughts like a blade. The judge had moved to stand behind a thin, sickly-looking woman with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes. Mary Patterson, age 19, debts totaling $47. Her family has disowned her for moral failings. Do I hear an opening bid? The auction proceeded with sickening efficiency. One by one, desperate men stepped forward to claim their human prizes. A grizzled prospector took Mary for $60, grinning toothlessly as she was led away in tears. A saloon-keeper acquired a young widow for $85, already calculating how she might earn back her price. With each transaction, Louis felt his stomach churn with disgust. This wasn't justice, it was barbarism dressed in legal robes. Yet he remained frozen in place, watching the horror unfold with the fascination of a man witnessing a train wreck. Finally, only one woman remained. Abigail Yodar stood alone in the center of the square, her chin raised in quiet dignity as Judge Bradock approached her with predatory satisfaction. And now, Bradock announced, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain, "We come to our final offering. Abigail Yodar, age 26, late of the Amish community of Cedar Valley." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the story. How the Amish elders had cast her out for questioning their ways, how her own family had turned their backs on her, how she had wandered into San Miguel with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of coins that weren't enough to keep her fed for a week. "Miss Yodar," Bradock continued, circling her like a shark scenting blood, "owes the county $63 in fines and fees. She has been charged with vagrancy, public disturbance, and," he paused for dramatic effect, "corrupting the moral fiber of our community by spreading heretical religious views." The crowd jeered and catcalled. Someone shouted, "What man would want that cow?" Another voice yelled, "Bid on her by the pound." Through it all, Abby stood motionless. Her eyes had found something beyond the crowd, perhaps the distant mountains that ring the valley, perhaps some inner landscape of faith and hope that these people could never touch. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying a hint of the German accent that marked her Amish heritage. "I am not cattle to be sold," she said simply. "I am a daughter of God, same as any other soul in this square." Her words struck the crowd like a physical blow. The jeering faltered, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Even Judge Bradock seemed momentarily taken aback by her quiet dignity, but the moment passed quickly. Bradock's cruel smile returned sharper than before. "Cattle, Miss Yodar, perhaps you're right. Cattle have value. Now then, gentlemen, what am I bid for this robust specimen? She's clearly built for hard work, if nothing else. Think of her as an investment in agricultural labor." The crowd exploded in laughter again, the brief moment of shame washed away by renewed cruelty. Men shouted increasingly crude suggestions about Abby's potential uses. The noise grew deafening, a wave of human ugliness that seemed to press down on the square like a suffocating blanket. "Come now," Bradock called out over the din. "Surely someone needs a strong back and willing hands. I'll start the bidding at $20, a bargain price for such substantial help around the homestead." No hands rose, the laughter continued, but underneath it was an edge of vicious satisfaction. This was what the crowd had really come for, not just to see desperate women auctioned off, but to witness the complete humiliation of someone they saw as different as other, as beneath them. $15 then. Bradock's voice carried a note of theatrical disappointment. 10, surely someone can spare $10 for such a charitable cause. Still no response. Abby closed her eyes for a moment, and Louis could see her lips moving in what he recognized as silent prayer. The sight hit him like a physical blow, dredging up memories of his own wife's final days, when prayer had been all they had left to cling to. $5. Bradock was really enjoying himself now, his voice mocking and cruel. "Come now, gentlemen, $5 is barely the price of a decent meal. Surely this fine example of feminine virtue is worth at least that much. The crowd was loving every moment of this degradation. Women fanned themselves and whispered behind their hands, while their husbands guffawed and slapped each other on the back. Children, mimicking their parents' cruelty, pointed and giggled at the lone figure standing in the center of the square. That's when something inside Louis Boon finally snapped. He thought of Sarah, sweet Sarah, who had never said an unkind word about anyone in her entire short life. He thought of the ranch that had become a tomb since her death, empty rooms echoing with memories and regrets. He thought of young Henry, the half-Apache boy he'd taken in out of duty rather than love, who deserved so much better than the hollow shell of a man Louis had become. Most of all, he thought of the woman standing alone in that courthouse square, maintaining her dignity in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. She reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, that goodness existed in the world, that some people still believed in things like honor and mercy and the basic worth of every human soul. "I'll take her." The words left his mouth before he'd fully realized he was going to speak them. They cut through the noise of the crowd like a rifle shot, leaving sudden absolute silence in their wake. Every head in the square turned toward him. Judge Bradock's mouth hung open in shock. The crowd stared as if Louis had just announced his intention to marry a three-headed serpent. Louis stepped forward, his boots ringing against the hard-packed earth with the sound of destiny approaching. He was acutely aware of every eye upon him, every breath held in anticipation, but his gaze was fixed solely on Abigail Yodar. For the first time since he'd spoken, she looked directly at him, and he saw something in her blue eyes that made his chest tighten. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if she too understood that this moment was bigger than either of them had planned. "I said, I'll take her." Louis repeated, his voice stronger now, carrying across the silent square with quiet authority. Judge Bradock recovered his composure with visible effort, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied this unexpected bidder. He knew Louis by reputation, if not personally. The grieving rancher who'd become something of a hermit since his wife's death, the man who kept to himself and paid his bills on time and caused no trouble for anyone. "Mr. Boon, isn't it?" Bradock's voice carried a note of surprise tinged with suspicion. "You wish to bid on Miss Yodar?" "I wish to pay her debt," Louis corrected firmly. "All of it. $63, you said." The crowd began to murmur again, a sound like distant thunder. This wasn't how the script was supposed to play out. They'd come to see the Amish woman humiliated, not rescued by some knight in shining armor. Someone in the crowd called out, "Louis, you gone loco. That woman's bigger than your prize bull." Another voice joined in, "Hell, Boon, you can get yourself a real woman for that kind of money." But Louis ignored them all. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, counting out bills with deliberate care. The money represented months of careful saving funds he'd been setting aside to repair his barn roof before winter. Now, without a moment's hesitation, he was about to spend it all on a woman he'd never spoken to, driven by an impulse he couldn't fully explain or justify. Judge Bradock watched this display with growing irritation. The auction was supposed to be entertainment, a chance to humiliate the weak and desperate while lining the county's coffers. Louis Boon's unexpected gallantry was ruining the entire performance. "Mr. Boon," Bradock said carefully, "perhaps you haven't fully considered the implications of what you're proposing. This woman has been cast out by her own people. She has nothing to offer a man of your standing in the community." Louis finished counting his money and looked up, his dark eyes blazing with an anger that had been building for the past hour. "Judge Bradock, with all due respect, I don't recall asking for your opinion on my personal choices." The crowd gasped at this display of defiance. Nobody spoke to Judge Bradock that way, not if they wanted to stay on his good side. But Louis was past caring about consequences. He'd spent 3 years being careful, being quiet, being the grieving widower who caused no trouble and made no waves. Today, all of that ended. The lady has debts. Louis continued, his voice carrying clearly across the square. I'm prepared to pay them. Unless there's some legal reason I can't do that, I suggest we conclude this transaction and let folks get on with their day. Bradock's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He'd been publicly challenged, his authority questioned in front of the entire town, but legally, Louis was within his rights. The auction was supposed to find someone willing to assume the debts, and Louis had done exactly that. Very well, Bradock said through gritted teeth. $63 it is. Louis approached the courthouse steps and placed the money in the judge's outstretched hand. The bills changed ownership with an almost ceremonial gravity, each one representing not just payment of a debt, but the transformation of two lives forever. Miss Yodar, Bradock announced with poorly concealed distaste, your debts have been assumed by Mr. Louis Boon. According to the laws of this territory, you are now bound to him in marriage until such time as your obligations are fulfilled. He turned to Louis with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Congratulations, Mr. Boon. I hope you find your investment everything you hoped for. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, but their appetite for gossip just beginning. Louis could hear the whispered conversations already starting, speculation about his motives, jokes about the unlikely pairing predictions, about how long such a marriage could possibly last. But he paid them no attention. His focus was entirely on the woman who now stood before him, no longer the object of public humiliation, but his wife in the eyes of the law. Up close he could see details that the crowd had missed or chosen to ignore. Yes, she was a large woman, but there was strength in her frame, not just excess. Her hands, though work-worn, were clean and capable. Her face, while not conventionally pretty by the standards of the day, held an intelligence and dignity that made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or artifice. Miss Yodar, he said quietly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. I'm Louis Boon. I have a ranch about an hour's ride north of here. If you're willing, I'd like to take you home. Abby studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Perhaps signs of the cruelty or ulterior motives she'd learned to expect from the world. But Louis's dark eyes held only kindness and a deep sadness that spoke of his own suffering. She'd heard about him, of course. The whole territory knew the story of the rancher who'd lost his beloved wife and retreated from the world in his grief. Mr. Boon, she said finally, her voice soft but clear. I cannot pretend to understand why you did what you just did, but I want you to know that I'm grateful and I'll work hard to repay your kindness. There's no debt between us, Louis replied firmly. What happened here today, nobody should have to endure that. Nobody. He gestured toward his wagon loaded with supplies and hitched to two sturdy horses. I know this is all sudden and I don't expect, that is, I want you to know that you'll have your own room, your own space. This marriage is legal, but it doesn't have to be, well, it can be whatever feels right to both of us. The delicacy with which he approached the subject touched Abby deeply. In her short life, she'd encountered few men who spoke to her with such consideration. Most saw her size and assumed she was either desperate for any attention or completely undesirable. Louis seemed to see her as simply a human being deserving of respect. That's very kind of you, she said. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. As they walked toward the wagon, Louis found himself wondering what had possessed him to act so impulsively. He'd come to town for fence wire and grain, not a wife. He had no plan for how to integrate this stranger into his life, no clear idea of what their future together might look like. All he knew was that watching her stand alone in that square, maintaining her dignity in the face of such cruelty, had awakened something in him that had been sleeping since Sarah's death. Mr. Boon, Abby said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. Might I ask, do you have children? In a manner of speaking, Louis replied, settling beside her and taking up the reins. There's a boy, Henry. He's 12, half Apache. His mother died in childbirth and his father, well, his father wasn't the staying kind. I took him in a few months back." Abby nodded thoughtfully. Children need stability. They need to know they're wanted. Something in her tone caught Louis's attention. He glanced at her sideways as they drove through the town's dusty streets, noting the way her hands rested protectively over her stomach. It was a gesture he'd seen before in women who'd lost children or longed for them. Do you have experience with children?" he asked carefully. "Some," Abby replied, her voice becoming distant. "Back in Cedar Valley before everything changed. I helped in the schoolhouse, minded the little ones during harvest time. Children are honest in a way that adults often aren't. They see past things that don't really matter." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the town fading behind them as they headed north toward the rolling hills that marked the boundary of Louis's ranch. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but there was a slight breeze that carried the scent of sagebrush and wild grass, a promise of the open country ahead. "Miss Yodar," Louis said, eventually, "might I ask what happened with your community? I mean, you don't have to tell me if it's too painful, but—" Abby was quiet for so long that Louis began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with old pain. "I questioned things that weren't supposed to be questioned," she said simply. "Our Bishop Ezra Stoltzfus was a hard man who believed that suffering was God's way of testing faith. When the harvest failed 2 years running and children were going hungry, I suggested that maybe we should ask for help from the English, from outside communities. I said that God might work through other people too, not just through us." She paused, watching a hawk circle overhead before continuing. "That was my first sin, according to Bishop Stoltzfus. My second was worse. I spoke up when he arranged a marriage between his nephew and a girl who was only 14. I said she was too young, that it wasn't right to force such a thing. I said that God wouldn't want a child to suffer, just to keep peace in the community." Louis felt his jaw tighten with anger. He'd heard stories about such practices in some of the stricter religious communities, but hearing it from Abby made it real in a way that cut straight to his heart. "What happened then?" he asked gently. "The elders met and decided I was a corrupting influence," Abby said matter-of-factly. "They said my questions showed a lack of faith, that I was putting worldly concerns above spiritual ones. They gave me a choice: submit completely to their authority or leave the community forever. And you chose to leave." "I chose to remain true to what I believed God was telling me in my heart," Abby corrected, "even if it meant losing everything else." The simple courage of that statement took Louis's breath away. This woman had given up her family, her community, her entire way of life rather than compromise her principles. She'd chosen exile and poverty over the safety of conformity. It was a kind of bravery that Louis wasn't sure he possessed. "That must have been terrifying," he said. "It was," Abby admitted, "but also freeing in a way. For the first time in my life, I was answerable only to God and my own conscience. That's worth something, even if it comes at a high price." They were climbing now, the wagon wheels crunching over gravel as the road wound through the foothills. The landscape was harsh, but beautiful. Red rock formations jutting up from stands of pine and aspen meadows, dotted with wildflowers that somehow found a way to thrive in the thin mountain soil. It was a land that demanded strength from those who tried to make a living from it, but it also offered rewards to those who understood its rhythms. "There," Louis pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between two hills. "That's home." Abby studied the ranch with the practiced eye of someone who'd grown up on a farm. The main house was modest but well built, with a wide porch that spoke of evenings spent watching the sunset. The barn was larger than she'd expected, clearly the product of years of careful expansion. Corrals and outbuildings were arranged with an efficiency that suggested their owner was someone who thought ahead who planned for both good times and bad. But there were also signs of neglect. A broken fence rail here, a loose shutter there, weeds growing in what had once been a garden. These were the marks of a man who'd been going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. Abby recognized them because she'd seen similar signs in the mirror during her own darkest days. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "How long have you lived here?" 8 years, Louis replied. "Sarah and I built most of it ourselves, piece by piece. After she died, I kept the stock fed and the essential repairs done, but I haven't put much effort into the rest." As they pulled up to the house, a boy emerged from the barn. Henry was small for his 12 years, with the dark hair and bronze skin that marked his Apache heritage. His clothes were clean but patched, and there was a wariness in his dark eyes that spoke of too much experience with a world that didn't always welcome children like him. Louis climbed down from the wagon and turned to help Abby, his movements careful and respectful. "Henry," he called to the boy, "come meet Mrs. Boon." Henry approached slowly, his expression unreadable. Abby could see the intelligence in his eyes, but also the careful reserve of a child who'd learned not to trust too quickly or hope too much. "Henry," Louis said gently, "this is Abigail. She's going to be living with us now." The boy nodded politely but said nothing. Abby knelt down to bring herself closer to his eye level, a gesture that surprised both Henry and Louis with its naturalness. "Hello, Henry," she said warmly. "That's a fine horse you've got there." She nodded toward a paint gelding visible in the corral. "What's his name?" "Thunder," Henry replied quietly, his first word since their arrival. "Thunder," Abby repeated thoughtfully. "That's a strong name. I bet he's fast, too." Henry's eyes lit up slightly. "He can outrun anything on 4 legs in the county," he said with sudden pride. "I'd like to meet him properly sometime, if that's all right with you," Abby said. "I grew up around horses. My father always said they were good judges of character." Something in Henry's posture relaxed at that. He'd been bracing himself for the usual adult condescension or false cheer, but Abby spoke to him as if his opinions mattered, as if he was a person worth knowing rather than just a charity case to be tolerated. Louis watched this interaction with growing amazement. In the months since Henry had come to live with him, the boy had remained polite but distant, never quite settling in despite Louis's best efforts. Yet here was Abby, a complete stranger, already finding ways to connect with him. "Well," Louis said finally, "let's get you settled in. Henry, would you help me with Mrs. Boon's things?" "I don't have much," Abby said, indicating her small satchel. "Just what I could carry." "We'll remedy that," Louis promised. "San Miguel's not much for shopping, but there's a general store that can order most anything you might need." As they walked toward the house, Abby took in more details of her new home. The porch was solid, built to last, but the rocking chairs that should have graced it were nowhere to be seen. The windows were clean but bare, no curtains or signs of a woman's touch. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Inside, the effect was even more pronounced. The main room was spacious and well-proportioned, with a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The furniture was sturdy but sparse, a table, several chairs, a bookshelf with a scattering of volumes. Everything was clean but austere, functional, without being welcoming. "The kitchen's through here," Louis said, gesturing toward a doorway. Sarah always said it was the heart of the house. The kitchen was larger than Abby had expected, with good light from east-facing windows and a substantial wood-burning stove that spoke of many family meals prepared with care. But like the rest of the house, it felt abandoned somehow, as if the life had gone out of it, along with its previous mistress. "It's a good kitchen," Abby said diplomatically. "Well designed for someone who likes to cook." "Do you?" Louis asked. "Like to cook, I mean, because I should warn you, Henry and I have been living mostly on beans and bread for the past few months. Neither of us has much talent in that direction." Abby smiled, the first real smile Louis had seen from her since the courthouse. It transformed her face, bringing warmth to her blue eyes and revealing dimples he hadn't noticed before. "I do like to cook," she said, "and from what I can see, this kitchen has everything I'd need to make proper meals. It just needs someone to bring it back to life." Louis showed her through the rest of the house, a small parlor that clearly hadn't been used in years, his own bedroom with its carefully made but empty bed, and finally the room that would be hers. "This was going to be—" he started, then stopped himself. "Well, it's yours now. I hope it suits." The room was painted in soft yellow with windows that looked out over the valley toward the distant mountains. There was a bed with a colorful quilt, a dresser with an oval mirror, and a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. It was clearly a room that had been prepared with love, though for whom Abby could only guess. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Louis nodded, suddenly awkward in the face of her gratitude. "I'll leave you to get settled then. Supper's usually around 6, though I should warn you that it's likely to be pretty basic fare." After he left, Abby sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new room. 3 hours ago, she'd been standing in a courthouse square being auctioned off like livestock. Now she was the mistress of a ranch with a room of her own and a kitchen to command. It was almost too much to take in. She unpacked her few belongings methodically. A spare dress, some undergarments, her mother's Bible, the one thing she'd taken from Cedar Valley, and a small wooden carving of a horse that her father had made for her when she was a child. These items spread across the dresser seemed pathetically small in the face of her new circumstances. But as she sat in the rocking chair and looked out at the view, Abby felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just the desperate hope of survival that had carried her through the worst times, but real hope for the future. Maybe she could build something here, create a life that honored both her faith and her desire to make a difference in the world. Downstairs, Louis was pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. In the space of an afternoon, he'd acquired a wife he barely knew, and completely upended the careful routine that had kept him functioning since Sarah's death. What would people say? What would they think? And more importantly, what in God's name was he supposed to do now? Henry appeared in the doorway, studying Louis with the perceptive gaze that sometimes made the boy seem much older than his 12 years. "You like her," Henry said. "It wasn't a question. I barely know her," Louis protested. "You like her anyway," Henry persisted. "I can tell. You look different when you talk to her." Louis paused in his pacing, struck by the observation. "How do I look different?" "Less sad," Henry said simply. "Less like you're carrying something heavy all the time." The words hit Louis like a physical blow. He'd thought he'd been hiding his grief better than that, but children saw things that adults missed. If Henry could read his emotions so clearly, what else had the boy noticed during their time together? "What do you think of her?" Louis asked, genuinely curious about the boy's opinion. Henry considered this seriously. "She doesn't talk to me like I'm stupid or broken," he said finally. "Most adults do one or the other, but she talks to me like I'm just me." It was perhaps the longest speech Henry had made since coming to live at the ranch, and it told Louis more about the boy's experiences than months of gentle questioning had revealed. "She asked about Thunder like she really wanted to know," Henry continued, "not like she was just being polite." "Maybe you could show him to her tomorrow," Louis suggested. "If you want to, I mean." Henry nodded seriously. "I think she'd like that." As evening approached, the three of them came together in the kitchen for what Louis had warned would be a simple meal. But somehow, with Abby moving efficiently around the space, even beans and bread became something more substantial. She'd found vegetables in the root cellar that Louis had forgotten about, herbs growing wild behind the house that she'd somehow known how to use. The result was a stew that filled the kitchen with warmth and the promise of better meals to come. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, but it was different from the oppressive quiet that had characterized meals between Louis and Henry. This was the silence of people getting to know each other, of new relationships taking shape. "This is very good," Louis said, breaking the quiet. "I'd forgotten what real cooking tastes like." "It's just simple food," Abby replied modestly, "but there's no reason simple can't be satisfying." After supper, Henry disappeared to tend to his horse, leaving Louis and Abby alone for the first time since their arrival at the ranch. They sat on the porch in the gathering dusk, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I want you to know," Louis said finally, "that I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. This marriage, it's legal, but it doesn't have to be anything more than that unless we both want it to be." Abby was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "That's very kind of you to say," she replied, "and I appreciate your consideration, but I want you to know that I take marriage seriously, legal or not. If we're going to make this work, we need to be honest with each other." "What kind of honesty are you thinking about?" "Well," Abby said slowly, "for instance, you should know that I'm not likely to give you children. I'm 26 and I've never, that is, there are reasons to think that might not be possible for me." The admission cost her something. Louis could hear it in her voice. In a world where a woman's value was largely measured by her ability to bear children, such a confession was tantamount to declaring herself defective. "Abby," Louis said gently, using her name for the first time, "I married you because you needed help, and because something about you reminded me that there's still goodness in the world. If children come, that would be a blessing. If they don't, it doesn't change anything about why I brought you home." His words broke something loose in Abby's chest, a knot of tension she'd been carrying since her exile from Cedar Valley. For the first time in months, she felt tears threaten, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can't know what that means to me." They sat in companionable silence as full darkness settled over the valley. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a sound that spoke of wild spaces and untamed possibilities. Somewhere in the barn, Henry was probably bedding down thunder for the night, following routines that gave shape to his young life. "Louis," Abby said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What was she like? Your first wife, I mean, Sarah." Louis was quiet for so long that Abby began to think she'd overstepped, asked something too personal for their fragile new relationship. But when he finally spoke, his voice was warm with memory rather than sharp with pain. "She was light," he said simply, "not in size. She was tiny, barely came up to my shoulder, but in spirit, in the way she moved through the world. She could find something to laugh about in almost any situation. She made everything seem possible. She sounds wonderful." She was, but she's gone and I'm still here, and life has to go on somehow. He turned to look at Abby in the starlight. "I spent 3 years trying to hold on to her memory so tightly that I forgot how to live. Today, for the first time, I did something that felt like moving forward instead of just marking time, even if it was impulsive and possibly foolish." Louis chuckled, a sound that surprised them both, especially because it was impulsive and possibly foolish. "Sarah always said my best decisions were the ones I made with my heart instead of my head." As they prepared to go inside, Abby touched Louis's arm gently. "I know this isn't what either of us planned," she said, "but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Sometimes the best paths are the ones we never thought to look for." Louis nodded, struck once again by her wisdom. "Maybe you're right. Good night, Abby." "Good night, Louis." As they parted ways at the top of the stairs, each heading to their separate rooms, both carried with them the sense that something significant had begun. Neither could have predicted where this impulsive rescue would lead, but for the first time in years, both felt the stirring of something that might eventually become hope. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of change. The ranch that had slept in grief for 3 years was waking up, and with it the possibility that 3 broken souls might find a way to become something stronger together than any of them had been alone. In the barn, Henry finished brushing Thunder's coat and whispered secrets to the patient horse. For the first time since coming to the ranch, he felt something like excitement about tomorrow. The new woman, Mrs. Boon, had looked at him like he mattered, like his thoughts and feelings were worth considering. Maybe, just maybe, this strange new family might actually work. And in the house, in their separate rooms, Louis and Abby each lay awake, thinking about the improbable chain of events that had brought them together. Neither knew what the future would bring, but both sensed that their lives had just taken a turn toward something unprecedented and possibly wonderful. The foundation had been laid. Now the real work would begin. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold, as Abby stood at her bedroom window watching the ranch come to life. She'd been awake for an hour listening to the sounds of a working homestead, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of the windmill, and most telling of all the voices of Louis and Henry as they went about their morning chores. There was an efficiency to their movements that spoke of long practice, but also a careful distance between them that suggested their partnership was based more on necessity than affection. She dressed quickly in her brown work dress, pinning her prayer cap securely over hair that she'd braided in the pre-dawn darkness. Today would be her first full day as mistress of this house, and she intended to make it count. But first, she needed to understand the rhythms and routines that governed life here. Downstairs, the kitchen still held the lingering warmth from last night's cooking fire, but the room felt cold in other ways. Louis had clearly made coffee before heading out. She could smell it strong and slightly bitter, but there was no sign of breakfast preparation. On the table sat a plate with the remnants of what looked like cold biscuits and a jar of honey, evidence of the bachelor meal that had sustained the household before her arrival. Through the window she could see Louis working in the corral with a magnificent black stallion that fought every attempt to be saddled. His movements were patient but firm, and she could hear his voice low and steady, talking the animal through its resistance. Further away, Henry sat on the top rail of another fence, watching the proceedings with the intense focus of someone learning a trade. Abby set about preparing a proper breakfast, working quickly but thoroughly. She found eggs in the henhouse, a task that required some negotiation with a particularly aggressive Rhode Island red, and discovered that the root cellar held more treasures than she'd initially realized. Soon the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of bacon frying, biscuits baking, and fresh coffee brewing. When Louis and Henry finally came in, drawn by aromas that spoke of comfort and care, they found the table set with blue and white dishes that had clearly been Sarah's pride. Abby had discovered them in the back of a cupboard wrapped carefully in cloth and unused since their original owner's death. "Good morning," she said warmly, wiping her hands on the apron she'd fashioned from a kitchen towel. "I hope you're hungry." Henry's eyes went wide at the sight of the spread before them. Eggs cooked exactly right, bacon crisp, but not burned, biscuits golden and steaming, even a small crock of butter she'd somehow managed to churn from cream she'd found in the ice house. "This is—" Louis started, then stopped, seeming unable to find words for what he was feeling. The sight of Sarah's dishes on the table filled with food prepared by another woman's hands was both wonderful and heartbreaking in ways he hadn't anticipated. "This is amazing." Henry finished for him, sliding into his chair with an enthusiasm he rarely showed for anything besides his horse. "Mrs. Boon, how did you do all this so fast?" "Practice," Abby said with a smile, settling into her own chair. "And please, call me Abby. Mrs. Boon makes me feel ancient." As they ate with the focused attention of people who'd been surviving rather than dining for too long, Louis found himself watching Abby as she moved around the kitchen, noting the unconscious grace with which she managed multiple tasks, the way she seemed to know instinctively where things belonged, even in an unfamiliar space. "The stallion in the corral," Abby said as she refilled Louis's coffee cup. "He's a beautiful animal. Been giving you trouble long?" Louis nodded ruefully. "Diablo's been fighting me for 6 months now. Previous owner said he was broken to saddle, but I'm starting to think he meant broken in spirit, not training. Some days I wonder if I should just cut my losses and sell him." "What does your heart tell you about him?" Abby asked, settling back into her chair. The question caught Louis off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing most people asked about livestock. The practical considerations of cost and return usually trumped sentiment in ranch life. "My heart says he's got potential," Louis admitted. "There's intelligence in his eyes, and when he's not fighting the saddle, his gaits are smooth as silk. But hearts don't pay bills." "Sometimes they do, though," Abby said thoughtfully. "Back in Cedar Valley, my father had a mare that everyone said was worthless. Too stubborn, too skittish, couldn't be trusted. But Papa saw something in her, spent months just sitting in her stall, talking to her, letting her get used to his presence. By the end of that first year, she was the finest riding horse in 3 counties. Henry looked up from his plate with interest. "What made the difference?" "Time and respect," Abby replied. "Papa said that broken horses are like broken people. They need to learn to trust again before they can learn to love. Force just makes them more afraid." Louis felt something stir in his chest at those words. There was wisdom there that went far beyond horse training, an understanding of healing that spoke to his own wounded heart. "Maybe I've been approaching Diablo all wrong," he mused, "trying to impose my will instead of earning his cooperation. Might be worth trying a different approach," Abby suggested gently. "What's the worst that could happen?" After breakfast, Henry disappeared to tend to thunder while Louis headed back to the corrals. Abby remained in the kitchen washing dishes and taking inventory of what the household would need, but her attention kept drifting to the window, where she could see Louis working with Diablo using a different approach. Slower, more patient talking to the horse in low, soothing tones. The sound of hoofbeats on the main road drew her attention away from the domestic scene. A rider was approaching at a fast-clipped dust plume, marking his progress across the valley floor. As he drew closer, Abby could see it was a man in his 30s, well-dressed in the manner of someone who spent more time in offices than on horseback. Louis had noticed the visitor too and was walking toward the house, his expression wary. In a territory where neighbors were few and visitors rare, unexpected arrivals usually meant trouble of one kind or another. The rider pulled up in front of the house with a flourish that suggested he was accustomed to making dramatic entrances. He was handsome in a polished way, with carefully styled brown hair and clothes that spoke of Eastern tailoring. But there was something about his eyes, pale blue and calculating, that made Abby instinctively step back from the window. "Mr. Boon," the stranger called out, dismounting with practiced ease. "Clayton Reeves, representing the Colorado and Eastern Railroad. I believe we have business to discuss." Louis's expression darkened. "If this is about that survey you conducted last month, I told your people then that I'm not interested in selling." Reeves smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Oh, Mr. Boon, I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a matter of buying and selling anymore. This is about legal obligations and existing rights." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with official-looking documents. "You see, after careful research into the territorial land records, we've discovered some irregularities in your claim to this property." Abby moved closer to the window, her heart beginning to race. She'd seen men like Reeves before, smooth-talking officials who used legal language to steal what they couldn't buy honestly. During her time with the Amish, she'd watched them lose 2 farms to similar tactics. "What kind of irregularities?" Louis asked, his voice dangerous quiet. "Well," Reeves said, spreading papers on the porch table as if he owned the place. "It seems the original territorial grant that established this ranch was never properly filed with the Federal Land Office. Without proper federal recognition, your claim is, shall we say, legally questionable." Louis stepped closer, his hands clenching into fists. "That's impossible. I have the deed signed and witnessed. I've paid taxes on this land for 8 years. "Oh, I'm sure you have local documentation," Reeves said dismissively. "But territorial paperwork isn't worth much if it contradicts federal authority. And according to our research, this entire valley was designated as a potential right-of-way for railroad development back in 1867. Before I ever filed my claim, Louis protested. Exactly, Reeves beamed, as if Louis had made his point for him, which means your claim was invalid from the beginning. Now the railroad is prepared to be generous in this matter. We're willing to offer you fair compensation for the improvements you've made. The house, the barn, the corrals. Say $200. The insult of the offer hit Louis like a physical blow. He'd put 8 years of his life into this ranch, built it from nothing with his own hands and Sarah's help. The improvements alone were worth 10 times what Reeves was offering, never mind the land itself. Get off my property, Louis said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of menace that wise men heeded. But Reeves either wasn't wise or was too confident in his legal position to be intimidated. Mr. Boon, I understand you're upset, but the law is the law. The Colorado and Eastern has valid federal authority to develop this route. If you force us to go through the courts, you'll end up with nothing but legal bills. Inside the house, Abby was remembering something her father had told her years ago about dealing with land grabbers. When someone waves papers at you, he'd said, the first thing you do is read them yourself. Most folks who steal with documents count on their victims being too scared or too ignorant to check the details. She slipped out the back door and made her way around the house, staying out of sight until she could get close enough to hear every word of the conversation. These documents, Louis was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. I suppose you expect me to just take your word for what they say. Of course not, Reeves replied smoothly. You're welcome to examine them, though I should warn you territorial law is quite complex. Most ranchers find it easier to trust the experts. Louis began reading through the papers, his expression growing more confused and frustrated with each page. The language was dense with legal terminology that seemed designed more to obscure than clarify, and Abby could see him struggling to make sense of what he was reading. That's when she stepped forward, emerging from around the corner of the house with a calm confidence that surprised everyone present. Excuse me, gentlemen, she said politely, but I couldn't help overhearing. Mr. Reeves, did you say these documents establish federal authority for railroad development? Reeves looked her up and down, dismissively, taking in her plain dress and Amish cap. And you are Mrs. Boon, Abby replied with quiet dignity, and I have some experience with territorial land law. Louis looked at her in surprise, but there was something in her tone that made him step aside, allowing her to examine the documents. Experience? Reeves laughed condescendingly. Madam, I seriously doubt that someone of your background could possibly understand the complexities of federal land management. Abby ignored the insult and began reading through the papers with careful attention. Her father had been the unofficial legal advisor for their Amish community, helping members navigate the complex relationship between their religious beliefs and territorial law. She'd spent countless hours helping him research property disputes, learning to parse the deliberately confusing language that lawyers used to intimidate the unlearned. This is interesting, she said, after several minutes of careful reading. Mr. Reeves, this federal authorization you're citing, it's dated 1867, as you said, but it's also quite specific about the route the railroad is authorized to develop. Yes, and, well, according to this description, the authorized route runs along the Clearwater River Valley, approximately 15 miles north of here. This ranch sits in the little Clearwater Valley, which isn't mentioned anywhere in these documents. Reeves's confident smile flickered slightly. I'm sure you're mistaken. The territorial surveys can be confusing for someone without proper training. But Abby was just getting started. She'd found something else buried in the fine print of one of the supplemental documents. Mr. Reeves, this survey you conducted last month, the one that supposedly validates your claim to this land. Who authorized it? The Colorado and Eastern Railroad, of course acting under federal authority. And this federal authority, where exactly does it come from? Reeves was beginning to look less comfortable. The Railroad Act of 1862 as amended by subsequent territorial legislation. Abby nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I can see reference to that act here, but there's something strange about these dates. This survey authorization is dated last month, but it references territorial legislation that wasn't passed until 6 months ago. How could a federal right-of-way established in 1867 depend on territorial legislation from this year? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Louis looked from Abby to Reeves, beginning to understand that his wife had caught the railroad man in some kind of legal contradiction. Furthermore, Abby continued, her voice gaining strength, this federal authorization you're citing, it grants the railroad the right to survey and develop a specific route, but it doesn't grant the right to appropriate private property without due process. Even if your route description was accurate, which it isn't, you'd still need to go through territorial courts to establish eminent domain. Reeves was no longer smiling. Mrs. Boon, I think you're overcomplicating a simple matter of federal authority. Am I? Abby asked innocently. Because according to this document here, any disputes over territorial land claims must be resolved by territorial courts, not federal administrators. And this other document states quite clearly that existing property holders have the right to challenge any federal action that affects their holdings. She looked up from the papers with a sweet smile that somehow managed to be more threatening than Louis's earlier anger. So, unless you have a court order establishing eminent domain, Mr. Reeves, I believe you're trespassing on private property. The silence that followed was profound. Henry had emerged from the barn and was watching the proceedings with fascination, while Louis stared at his wife with a mixture of admiration and amazement. Finally, Reeves gathered up his papers with as much dignity as he could muster. This isn't over, Mr. Boon. The Colorado and Eastern has significant resources and political influence. We'll be back with proper documentation. When you come back, Abby said calmly, make sure you bring a territorial judge with you, because that's what it's going to take to remove us from land we own legally and free and clear. After Reeves rode away in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, Louis turned to Abby with wonder in his eyes. Where in the world did you learn to read legal documents like that? Abby smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders now that the immediate threat had passed. My father was what you might call a scholar of necessity. When you're part of a religious community that's often at odds with territorial law, you learn to protect yourself with knowledge. You made that man look like a fool, Henry said, admiringly, approaching them with Thunder's reins in his hand. No, Abby corrected gently. I just made sure he couldn't make fools of us. There's a difference. Louis was quiet for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. Do you think he'll be back? Oh, he'll be back, Abby said with certainty. Men like Reeves don't give up easily when there's money involved. But next time he'll be more careful about his paperwork. And if his paperwork is in order, Abby's expression grew serious. Then we'll have to be smarter than him. The law can be a weapon, but it can also be a shield, if you know how to use it properly. That afternoon, as they worked together around the ranch, Louis with the horses, Henry with the cattle, and Abby establishing order in the house, the railroad's threat hung over them like a storm cloud. But there was also something else, something that none of them spoke aloud, but all of them felt. For the first time since they'd come together, they felt like a family united against a common enemy. Louis found himself stealing glances at Abby as she hung laundry on the line, marveling at how quickly she'd transformed from the humiliated woman in the courthouse square to the confident defender of their home. There were depths to her that he was only beginning to understand, strengths that had been forged in trials he could barely imagine. As evening approached, they gathered for supper once again, but the mood was different from the night before. The shared crisis had stripped away some of the awkwardness between them, replacing it with the kind of trust that came from facing danger together. Abby, Louis said as they finished their meal, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." She looked at him expectantly, noting the seriousness in his tone. "When you defended our land today, when you took on that railroad lawyer, was that just about justice, or do you really think of this place as home?" The question was more loaded than it appeared on the surface. Louis was really asking whether she saw herself as a permanent part of this family or just a temporary ally in a legal battle. Abby was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Louis, 2 days ago I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a few coins in my pocket. Today I have a home, a family, and a purpose that feels more right than anything I've done in years. When that man threatened to take this away from us, I didn't think about law or justice. I thought about Henry not having a place to raise his horse, about you losing the land you built with your own hands, about me losing the first real home I've had since I left Cedar Valley." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a gesture that was both gentle and firm. "This is my home now, Louis. Our home, and I'll fight for it with everything I have." Henry, who had been listening to this exchange with the intensity that children brought to adult conversations that might affect their world, felt something ease in his chest. For months he'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this temporary sanctuary to dissolve the way everything else good in his life had. But listening to Abby claim this place as home, watching Louis look at her with something that might eventually become love, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found a family that wouldn't abandon him. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of storms ahead. But inside the house, 3 people who had started as strangers were beginning to discover what it meant to be a family, and that they were all beginning to understand was worth fighting for. The battle with the railroad was far from over, but they would face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. The promised storm arrived 3 days later, bringing with it more than just rain and wind. As thick clouds gathered over the valley and the first fat drops began to fall, Louis stood at the kitchen window watching a small group of riders approach through the gathering gloom. Even at a distance, he could make out Clayton Reeves's distinctive figure, but this time, the railroad lawyer wasn't alone. "Abby," Louis called quietly, his voice carrying a tension that made her look up immediately from the bread she was kneading. She wiped her hands on her apron and joined him at the window, her sharp eyes taking in the details of the approaching party. 5 men in total, Reeves and 4 others who sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence. One of them wore a star pinned to his vest, though whether it represented legitimate authority or purchased influence remained to be seen. "Henry," Abby said calmly, never taking her eyes off the riders, "go to the barn and stay there until we come get you." The boy started to protest. At 12, he was old enough to understand that running and hiding wasn't the courageous thing to do, but something in Abby's tone brooked no argument. He disappeared through the back door just as the riders pulled up in front of the house. "Mr. Boon," Reeves called out, his voice carrying clearly through the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof. "I've returned as promised, and this time I've brought proper authority." Louis stepped out onto the porch, Abby close behind him. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the yard into a muddy mess, but none of the riders seemed inclined to seek shelter. This was clearly meant to be a show of force, rather than a social call. The man with the star urged his horse forward. He was middle-aged and heavy-set, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen enough of the world's ugliness to become comfortable with adding to it. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "I'm Marshal Wade Hutchins, Territorial Authority," he announced, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded document. "I have here a writ of seizure duly authorized by Territorial Judge Morrison, commanding the immediate evacuation of these premises." Louis felt his heart sink. Judge Morrison was known throughout the territory as a man whose decisions could be influenced by the right combination of money and political pressure. If Reeves had managed to get Morrison's signature on official paperwork, their legal position had just become much more precarious. "Marshal," Abby said, stepping forward with the same calm dignity she'd shown during Reeves's first visit, "might we examine this writ before you proceed?" Hutchins looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "Lady, this ain't a social occasion. When a territorial marshal presents a writ, folks comply. They don't stand around asking questions." "Actually, Marshal," Abby replied with steel beneath her politeness, "territorial law specifically grants property owners the right to examine any legal documents before compliance is required, unless you're suggesting we should ignore territorial law." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Hutchins might be corrupt, but he wasn't stupid. Refusing to allow examination of the writ would raise questions about its legitimacy that could come back to haunt him later. With obvious reluctance, he handed over the document. Abby accepted it with steady hands, though Louis could see the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her nervousness. This wasn't like the previous encounter where Reeves had been operating on bluff and intimidation. If this writ was legitimate, they could be forced off their land at gunpoint. As Abby read through the document, her expression grew increasingly troubled. The writ appeared to be properly formatted and signed, complete with Judge Morrison's official seal. But as she studied the details more carefully, she began to notice discrepancies that suggested all was not as it appeared. "Mr. Reeves," she said, finally looking up from the papers, "this writ references a survey conducted by Territorial Land Office representatives. When exactly was this survey performed?" Reeves shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The date is clearly stated in the documentation." "Yes, it is," Abby agreed. "September 15th of this year, but that's curious because according to this writ, the survey was conducted by Chief Territorial Surveyor James McKinley. Isn't Mr. McKinley currently in Denver testifying before the territorial legislature about railroad land grants?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Louis had heard about McKinley's testimony. It had been front-page news in the territorial papers, since it dealt with allegations of corruption in the granting of railroad rights-of-way. Marshal Hutchins's expression darkened. "Mrs. Boon, are you suggesting that this writ is fraudulent?" "I'm suggesting that either Mr. McKinley has learned to be in two places at once, or someone has been less than honest about the survey that supposedly justifies this seizure," Abby replied calmly. One of the other riders, a lean man with predatory eyes, urged his horse forward. "Marshal, we didn't come here to listen to some farm woman play lawyer. Let's just get them off the property and be done with it." But Hutchins held up a hand, his bureaucratic instincts warring with whatever arrangement he'd made with the railroad. If the writ was based on a fraudulent survey, using it to seize property could land him in federal prison. "There's another problem." Abby continued, her confidence growing as she found more flaws in the document. "This writ claims authority under the Federal Railroad Development Act of 1871, but that act was repealed and replaced by the Territorial Land Management Act of 1873, which has entirely different provisions for property seizure." Reeves was looking increasingly desperate. "These are minor technicalities, Marshal. The intent of the law is clear." "The law isn't about intent, Mr. Reeves," Abby said firmly. "It's about specific procedures designed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of overreach. And this writ fails to meet those standards in multiple ways." She turned back to Hutchins, her voice taking on a tone of reasonable authority that reminded Louis powerfully of a school teacher explaining a difficult concept to a struggling student. "Marshal, I'm sure you're aware that using fraudulent documents to seize private property is a federal crime. Even if you were acting in good faith based on information provided by Mr. Reeves, the penalties for wrongful seizure can be quite severe." Hutchins was clearly beginning to have second thoughts about the whole enterprise. He'd dealt with enough legal challenges in his career to recognize when he was standing on shaky ground. Furthermore, Abby continued pressing her advantage. There's the matter of Chief Surveyor McKinley's current location. If he's in Denver giving testimony as the newspapers report, then this survey couldn't have been conducted by him. That means someone has either forged his signature or falsely claimed his authority. Either way, Marshal, you're being asked to enforce a document based on false information. The rain was coming down harder now, and one of Reeves's men was clearly getting impatient with the extended legal discussion. Boss, maybe we should just handle this the simple way, he said, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. But Louis had heard enough. The threat to his wife, however subtle, triggered something primal in him that had nothing to do with law or legal procedures. Friend, Louis said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm menace that made smart men reconsider their options. If you're thinking about drawing that weapon, you'd better be prepared to use it. Because I promise you, threatening my wife on my own property is the last mistake you'll ever make. The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches. Hands moved closer to weapons. Horses sensed their riders' agitation and began to dance nervously, and the sound of rain seemed to grow louder in the charged silence. That's when salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. Through the curtain of rain, another rider approached at a steady pace. As he drew closer, Louis could see it was an older man, well-dressed but practical, with the kind of bearing that suggested authority earned rather than bought. "Marshal Hutchins," the newcomer called out as he pulled up beside the group. "I thought I might find you here." Hutchins' face went pale as he recognized the arrival. "Judge Patterson, I wasn't expecting to see you in this part of the territory." Judge Patterson was a circuit judge, one of the few territorial officials whose integrity was considered unquestionable. His presence here was either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that word of the railroad's activities had reached the right ears. "I was conducting hearings in Clearwater when I received some disturbing reports about irregular land seizures," Patterson said, his keen eyes taking in the scene before him. "Mrs. Boon, I believe I've heard some interesting things about your understanding of territorial law." Abby stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "Your Honor, we were just discussing some concerns about the validity of this seizure writ." Patterson extended his hand for the document, and Hutchins had no choice but to surrender it. As the judge read through the papers, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Marshal," Patterson said finally, "where exactly did you obtain this writ?" "Judge Morrison's office, Your Honor. Everything appeared to be in order." "I'm sure it did," Patterson replied dryly, "but I'm afraid there are several problems with this document, not least of which is that Judge Morrison is currently in Santa Fe attending his daughter's wedding. He's been there for 2 weeks. The silence that followed was deafening. Reeves looked like he wanted to disappear into the muddy ground while Hutchins stared at the writ in his hands as if it had turned into a poisonous snake. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "I've just come from a meeting with Chief Surveyor McKinley in Denver. He's been very specific about not having conducted any surveys in this territory for the past month. He's also expressed considerable concern about reports that his name and authority are being used without his knowledge." Reeves finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Your Honor, there must be some mistake. The Colorado and Eastern Railroad has valid federal authority." "Mr. Reeves," Patterson interrupted coldly, "the Colorado and Eastern Railroad has federal authority to survey a specific route along the Clearwater River 15 miles north of here. They have no authority whatsoever to seize private property, and they certainly have no authority to forge territorial documents." The judge's gaze swept over the assembled men with the kind of judicial authority that made even corrupt marshals straighten their shoulders. "Marshal Hutchins, I'm ordering you to return to town immediately and surrender this fraudulent writ to my clerk. I'll be conducting a full investigation into how it came to be issued, and I'll want your complete cooperation." Hutchins nodded quickly, clearly relieved to be given an escape route from what had become an untenable situation. Yes, Your Honor, right away. And Marshal, Patterson added, as Hutchins gathered his reins. If I hear of any further attempts to use questionable legal documents to harass law-abiding citizens, I'll consider it contempt of my court. Is that understood? Perfectly, Your Honor. As Hutchins and his men rode away through the rain, Reeves lingered for a moment, his face a mask of frustrated rage. But whatever he might have wanted to say died under Judge Patterson's steady gaze. Mr. Reeves, the judge said conversationally, I trust the Colorado and Eastern Railroad will confine its future activities to areas where it actually has legal authority. Otherwise, I suspect federal authorities might become interested in your methods of operation. Reeves spurred his horse and rode off without another word, leaving Judge Patterson alone with Louis and Abby on the porch. Your Honor, Louis said, finally finding his voice, I can't thank you enough for your intervention. Patterson dismounted and accepted Louis's invitation to come inside out of the rain. As they settled in the kitchen with hot coffee, the judge's formal demeanor relaxed somewhat. Actually, Mr. Boon, I should be thanking your wife, Patterson said with a slight smile. Word of her legal expertise has been making the rounds in territorial legal circles. It's not often we encounter someone with such a thorough understanding of land law. Abby blushed at the praise. I just read carefully, Your Honor. My father always said that ignorance of the law was the poor man's greatest enemy. Your father was a wise man, Patterson agreed, but reading carefully is more than most people manage, and applying what you've read under pressure is a rare skill indeed. He turned to Louis with a more serious expression. Mr. Boon, I'm afraid this incident isn't likely to be the end of your troubles with the railroad. There's a great deal of money involved in these Western development projects, and men like Reeves don't give up easily when they've set their sights on something. What would you recommend we do? Louis asked. Document everything, Patterson replied immediately. Every contact, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. Keep copies of all your property documents in a safe place, preferably with someone in town who can't be easily pressured. And most importantly, don't let them isolate you. The railroad's power comes from people feeling like they have to face these challenges alone. As the afternoon wore on and the rain continued to fall, Judge Patterson shared more details about the railroad's activities throughout the territory. It seemed the Colorado and Eastern was engaged in a systematic campaign to acquire land along their proposed route using a combination of legal pressure, economic intimidation, and outright fraud to force property owners to sell at below-market prices. The territorial government is concerned, Patterson admitted. Railroad development is important for the territory's future, but not at the expense of citizens' constitutional rights. That's why I've been investigating these reports of irregular seizures. When Henry finally emerged from the barn, soaked from the rain, but eager to hear what had happened, he found the adults engaged in serious conversation around the kitchen table. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone understood that the larger conflict was far from over. Henry, Judge Patterson said warmly, having been introduced to the boy, I understand you're quite the horseman. Your thunder sounds like a remarkable animal. Henry's face lit up at the chance to talk about his beloved horse. He's the fastest horse in the territory, Your Honor. Mr. Boon says he's got Arabian blood, which makes him smart as well as fast. Arabian blood, you say? Patterson's eyes sharpened with interest. That's quite valuable in this country. Have you considered registering him with the Territorial Horse Association? The suggestion was more than idle conversation. Registered horses carried legal protections that could make them difficult for unscrupulous individuals to acquire through questionable means. As evening approached, Judge Patterson prepared to continue his journey to the next town on his circuit. But before leaving, he pulled Abby aside for a private conversation. Mrs. Boon, he said quietly, I want you to know that what you did today, standing up to those men exposing their fraudulent documents, that took considerable courage. But I'm also concerned about the target it may have painted on your family." Abby nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the risks, Your Honor, but sometimes standing up to bullies is the only way to stop them from hurting other people." "Perhaps," Patterson agreed, "but if you find yourself in legal trouble, any kind of legal trouble, I want you to send word to me immediately. The territory needs people who understand that law should protect citizens, not be used as a weapon against them." After the judge left, the three members of the Boon family found themselves alone with the reality of what had just occurred. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Reeves and the railroad wouldn't simply give up and look for easier targets. If anything, having been publicly humiliated might make them more dangerous in their next approach. "What do you think they'll try next?" Henry asked as they sat around the table for a late supper. Louis and Abby exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing, but reluctant to voice their fears in front of the boy. "I don't know," Louis said finally, "but we'll face it together, whatever it is." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break, but inside the house, the three people who had started as strangers continued to forge bonds that would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The railroad had shown its hand today, and while they had been defeated, it was clear that much larger forces were at work. Abby looked around the kitchen, at Louis's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, at Henry's earnest young face, still flushed with excitement from the day's drama, at the home she was only beginning to make truly hers, and felt a fierce determination settle in her chest. This was her family now. This was her home. And whatever the railroad tried next, they would discover that some things were worth any fight required to protect them. The battle lines had been drawn, and there could be no retreat. The weeks following Judge Patterson's intervention brought an uneasy peace to the Boon Ranch, but it was the kind of quiet that preceded storms rather than signaled their end. Louis found himself checking the horizon more frequently, and Abby had taken to keeping the kitchen curtains drawn during the day. Small precautions that spoke to their shared understanding that the railroad's defeat had been temporary rather than final. It was during this period of watchful waiting that their lives began to settle into new rhythms. Henry had taken it upon himself to teach Abby to ride a process that proved both challenging and revelatory. Despite her size, she had a natural seat and gentle hands that the horses responded to immediately. More importantly, the lessons gave her and Henry time alone together, moments when the careful reserve that marked all the boys' relationships began to crack. "Mrs. Abby," Henry said one morning as they worked together in the corral, "can I ask you something?" Abby looked up from where she was brushing Thunder, noting the unusual formality in Henry's voice. In the weeks since her arrival, he'd gradually shifted from calling her Mrs. Boon to simply Abby. But this morning he seemed to be struggling with something that required extra politeness. "Of course, Henry. What's on your mind?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Thunder's neck while he gathered his thoughts. At 12, he was old enough to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but young enough to be confused by them. "Are you and Mr. Louis? Are you really married like the way married people are supposed to be?" The question caught Abby off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it forced her to confront truths she'd been trying not to examine too closely. Her marriage to Louis existed in a strange liminal space, legally binding but emotionally undefined, built on mutual respect and shared necessity rather than love. "What makes you ask that, Henry?" she said gently, settling down on a bale of hay and patting the spot beside her. Henry sat down reluctantly, his dark eyes fixed on his hands. "It's just, you have separate rooms and you don't look at each other the way my mother looked at my father before he left." The admission revealed more about Henry's past than he'd shared in all the months since coming to live at the ranch. Abby felt her heart ache for this boy who'd lost so much and was now trying to understand if he'd found something real or just another temporary arrangement that would eventually dissolve. "Henry," she said carefully, "marriage means different things to different people. Some marriages start with love and build from there. Others start with respect and friendship and see what grows over time. Which kind is yours? It was a fair question and one that deserved an honest answer. I don't know yet, Abby admitted. But I can tell you this. I care about you and Louis more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. This feels like home to me in a way that nowhere else ever has. Does that help? Henry nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his small frame. I was afraid that when the railroad trouble was over, you might leave. People usually leave, eventually. The matter-of-fact way he said it broke Abby's heart. This child had learned to expect abandonment the way other children expected breakfast, as an inevitable part of life's routine. Henry, she said firmly, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going anywhere. Not because of the railroad, not because of anything else. This is my home now and you're my family. That's not going to change. She reached over and took his hand, surprised by how small it felt in hers. I know it's hard to trust when people have let you down before, but sometimes you have to risk believing in something good, even if you're scared it might not last. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Both Abby and Henry jumped to their feet, the peaceful morning suddenly charged with tension. Through the corral rails, they could see a group of riders approaching the house. Not the railroad men this time, but townspeople from San Miguel, their faces grim with purpose. Louis emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness, his expression darkening as he recognized several faces in the approaching group. At their head rode Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man caught between his duty to uphold the law and the political pressures that came with his elected position. Louis, Sheriff Bradley called out as the group pulled up in front of the house, I need to speak with you and your wife. Official business, I'm afraid. Abby and Henry made their way from the corral to the house where Louis was already standing on the porch, with his arms crossed and his jaw set for trouble. The sheriff dismounted, but the other men remained on their horses, a show of force that was meant to intimidate. Sheriff, Louis said evenly, what brings you out here with such a large escort? Bradley looked uncomfortable, his weathered face creased with the kind of expression that suggested he was about to do something he didn't like but couldn't avoid. There's been some serious accusations made, Louis, about your wife. What kind of accusations? Abby asked, stepping forward to stand beside Louis. One of the other riders, a thin man with the pinched face of someone who'd never found joy in anything, spoke up before the sheriff could answer. Witchcraft, he said baldly. Mrs. Boon has been accused of practicing witchcraft and corrupting the natural order. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Louis felt his hands clench into fists, while Abby went very still beside him. Henry, standing slightly behind them, felt his stomach drop with a familiar dread, the feeling that came when the adults in his life were threatened by forces beyond his understanding. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, Louis said, his voice dangerous with suppressed anger. Who's making such accusations? Sheriff Bradley consulted a paper he'd withdrawn from his coat pocket. The complaint was filed by Mrs. Cordelia Hastings, supported by statements from several other prominent citizens. They claim that Mrs. Boon has been seen engaging in heathen practices, speaking in foreign tongues, and consorting with spirits. Abby almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but she could see from the sheriff's expression that he was taking the matter seriously. In a territory where superstition often carried as much weight as law, accusations of witchcraft were no laughing matter. Sheriff Bradley, she said calmly, I'm curious about these specific accusations. What exactly am I supposed to have done? The thin man spoke up again, his voice carrying the righteous fervor of someone who'd found a cause worthy of his hatred. Mrs. Hastings saw you in your garden at dawn speaking in a foreign tongue to plants that weren't growing. The next day, those same plants were thriving like nothing natural. That's witchcraft, plain and simple. This time Abby did laugh, a sound that seemed to take some of the wind out of her accuser's sails. I was speaking Pennsylvania Dutch to my herbs, Mr. Cornelius Thorne, the man replied stiffly. Mr. Thorne, Pennsylvania Dutch is the language I grew up speaking in my Amish community. As for the plants, they were suffering from a fungal infection that responds well to a mixture of soap and water applied at dawn when the air is cool. It's a technique my father learned from his father, who learned it from his. She looked around at the assembled men, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to children. It's called farming gentlemen, not witchcraft. But Thorne wasn't finished. That's just one incident. Mrs. Hastings also reports that you've been seen talking to that boy's horse as if it were a person, and the animal responds to you in ways that aren't natural. Henry stepped forward, his young face flushed with indignation. Thunder responds to anyone who treats him with kindness instead of fear. Mrs. Abby just knows how to talk to horses properly. Boy, Thorne said dismissively, your heritage makes you unreliable as a witness to Christian behavior. The racial slur hit the air like a physical blow. Louis took a step forward, his control finally snapping. Thorne, if you say one more word about that boy's heritage, I'll show you what unchristian behavior really looks like. Sheriff Bradley quickly stepped between them, recognizing that the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Now hold on, everyone, let's keep this civil. But Abby had heard enough. The accusation of witchcraft was absurd, but she recognized it for what it really was. A weapon designed to destroy her reputation and by extension undermine the legal victory she'd won against the railroad. In communities where a woman's word carried legal weight, only as long as her character remained unquestioned, accusations of moral or spiritual corruption could be devastatingly effective. Sheriff, she said with icy calm, I assume these accusations are being made under territorial law, which means I have the right to face my accusers in court. Bradley nodded reluctantly. That's correct. Judge Morrison will be conducting a hearing next week. Judge Morrison, Abby repeated thoughtfully. The same Judge Morrison who was supposedly in Santa Fe attending his daughter's wedding when that fraudulent writ was issued. The sheriff's face reddened slightly. Judge Morrison has returned from his travels and is once again available to conduct territorial business. How convenient, Louis said dryly. I suppose his sudden availability has nothing to do with the railroad's interest in our property. Thorne's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Mr. Boon, you'd be wise to distance yourself from this woman before her corruption spreads to your household. A man in your position can't afford to be associated with someone of questionable moral character. My position? Louis asked dangerously. A widower with a half-breed child to raise, Thorne replied with calculated cruelty. People are already talking about the irregularities in your household arrangements. Adding witchcraft to the mix won't help your standing in the community. The threat was clear. Cooperate with the railroad's plans by abandoning Abby or face social ostracism that could make life impossible for all of them. It was a sophisticated attack that went beyond legal maneuvering to strike at the heart of their family bonds. But Thorne had badly underestimated the people he was trying to intimidate. Louis's response was immediate and unequivocal. Mr. Thorne, Louis said with deadly quiet, my wife is the finest woman I've ever known, and my family arrangements are none of your damn business. If you or anyone else has a problem with how I choose to live my life, you're welcome to discuss it with me privately. But if you threaten my wife or my son again, you'll discover that there are some things worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. Henry felt a warmth spread through his chest at hearing Louis refer to him as my son, without qualification or hesitation. Despite all the uncertainty surrounding their unusual family, that simple phrase made him feel more secure than all the reassurances in the world. Sheriff Bradley could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Whatever political pressures had forced him to deliver these accusations, he had no desire to preside over a range war in his jurisdiction. Folks, he said firmly, I think we've said what needs to be said for now. Mrs. Boon, you'll need to appear before Judge Morrison next Tuesday at 10 o'clock to answer these charges. Louis, I'd recommend you find yourself a good lawyer. As the group prepared to leave, Thorne couldn't resist one final shot. Mrs. Boon, you might want to consider the welfare of that boy. Children suffer when they're raised in households touched by evil. This time it was Abby who stepped forward, her voice carrying a quality that made even Thorne's horse shy nervously. Mr. Thorne, she said with terrible calm, I've spent my entire life trying to follow the teachings of Christ, to feed the hungry, comfort the afflicted, and protect the innocent. If standing up for justice and defending my family makes me evil in your eyes, then I suggest you examine your own understanding of Christian virtue. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. But if you threaten my child again, and Henry is my child, make no mistake about that, you'll discover that there are some maternal instincts that transcend any accusations you might care to make. The raw power in her voice sent an involuntary shiver through several of the mounted men. There was nothing supernatural about it, but there was something primally protective that spoke to forces older and more fundamental than law or religion. After the accusers left, the three members of the Boon family stood on their porch in stunned silence, trying to process what had just occurred. The railroad had escalated their campaign in a way that none of them had anticipated, using the community's fears and prejudices as weapons more dangerous than any fraudulent legal documents. They're trying to destroy us, Henry said quietly, his young mind grasping the essential truth of their situation. They're trying, Louis agreed, but trying and succeeding are two different things. Abby was thinking furiously, her mind racing through legal precedents and territorial procedures. Louis, we need to get word to Judge Patterson immediately, and we need to start gathering character witnesses, people who can testify to my actual behavior rather than the fantasies Mrs. Hastings has been spreading. What about a lawyer? Louis asked. Bradley was right about that. We can't afford the kind of lawyer who would be willing to take on the railroad's influence, Abby replied practically. But I've been reading territorial law for years. If I can represent myself effectively, it might actually work in our favor. Jury sympathy for a woman defending herself against powerful accusers. Over the next several days, they threw themselves into preparation for the hearing, with the desperate energy of people whose entire future hung in the balance. Abby spent hours poring over legal texts, researching territorial precedents for witchcraft accusations and the standards of evidence required for conviction. Louis rode throughout the valley, speaking with neighbors and trying to gauge the community's sentiment. What he found was troubling but not hopeless. Many people were skeptical of the accusations themselves, but the railroad's influence was pervasive. Subtle pressures were being applied, threats to business relationships, hints about property taxes being reassessed, suggestions that cooperation with the right people would be remembered favorably when development money started flowing into the territory. But there were also allies. Doc Brennan, the territory's only trained physician, was appalled by the accusation and volunteered to testify about Abby's rational approach to healing. Sarah McKenna, who ran the general store, had heard about Abby's defense of the ranch against fraudulent legal documents and admired her courage. Most surprisingly, Father Miguel from the Catholic mission had approached Louis with an offer of support. "Your wife," the elderly priest had said in his accented English, "she speaks like someone who knows God in her heart, not just in her head. This is not witchcraft. This is faith in action." Meanwhile, Henry was conducting his own form of intelligence gathering. Children heard things that adults missed, and his careful questions to his few friends in town revealed disturbing information about the scope of the railroad's campaign. Hastings hadn't acted alone. She'd been approached by railroad representatives and encouraged to come forward with her accusations. Other women had been similarly contacted, though most had declined to involve themselves in what they saw as a dangerous game. The night before the hearing, the three of them sat around the kitchen table, making final preparations for what they all understood might be the most important day of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They'd come together as strangers bound by legal necessity, and now they were preparing to fight for their right to remain a family. "I want you both to know," Abby said quietly, looking from Louis to Henry, "that whatever happens tomorrow, these past weeks have been the happiest of my adult life. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a sense of belonging somewhere." Henry reached across the table and took her hand. "You belong here," he said with all the fierce certainty that only children could muster. "No matter what those people say tomorrow, you belong here with us." Louis covered both their hands with his own, the gesture cementing their bond in a way that words couldn't have achieved. "We face this together," he said simply. "All of us together." Early the next morning, they made the journey to San Miguel, in Louis's wagon, the same vehicle that had brought Abby home from her humiliation at the courthouse auction. But this time, she wasn't riding toward an uncertain future as a desperate woman with no choices. She was riding toward battle as part of a family willing to fight for what they'd built together. The courthouse square was packed in with spectators, the witchcraft hearing having drawn curious onlookers from throughout the territory. Judge Morrison sat behind his bench like a vulture in judicial robes, his pale eyes surveying the crowd with obvious satisfaction. Clearly, he intended this to be a show trial that would establish both his authority and the railroad's power once and for all. Clayton Reeves sat in the front row of spectators, his presence a not-so-subtle reminder of who was really orchestrating these proceedings. He caught Louis's eye as they entered the courtroom and smiled with cold satisfaction, confident that this time he would achieve through character assassination what fraudulent documents had failed to accomplish. But as Abby stood to face her accusers, something had changed in her demeanor since that first day in the courthouse square. Then she had endured humiliation with quiet dignity. Now she faced her enemies with the fierce determination of a woman who had found something worth fighting for and refused to let it be taken away. The battle for the Boon family's future was about to begin, and this time the stakes couldn't be higher. In a territory where a woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, and a man's honor determined his standing in the community, they were risking everything on the hope that truth and courage would prove stronger than money and corruption. As Judge Morrison called the court to order, Abby felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her, but she also felt the warmth of Louis's presence beside her and the knowledge that Henry was watching from the gallery, believing in her ability to protect their family. Whatever came next, she was no longer the abandoned woman who had once stood alone in this very courthouse at the mercy of men who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of. Now she was Mrs. Abigail Boon, and she intended to prove that some things were worth any fight required to defend them. Judge Morrison's gavel struck the bench with the finality of a coffin nail, its echo reverberating through the packed courtroom. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held in anticipation of the spectacle they'd come to witness. Abby felt the weight of their stares like a physical pressure, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the judge's face, reading the satisfied cruelty that lurked beneath his judicial mask. "This court is now in session," Morrison intoned, his voice carrying the pompous authority of a man drunk on his own power. "We are here to consider the serious charges of witchcraft and moral corruption brought against one Abigail Boon by Mrs. Cordelia Hastings and supported by several upstanding members of our community." Mrs. Hastings rose from her seat in the front row, her narrow face pinched with righteous indignation. She was a woman who had never found happiness in her own life and seemed determined to prevent others from finding it in theirs. Her dark dress and severe hairstyle gave her the appearance of a crow dressed for a funeral, and when she spoke, her voice carried the shrill edge of someone who had rehearsed her grievances until they had taken on the weight of gospel truth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling with what she clearly intended to be perceived as holy fear. "I come before this court not out of malice, but out of Christian duty to protect our community from the forces of darkness that have taken root among us." She gestured dramatically toward Abby, who remained seated calmly beside Louis, her hands folded in her lap and her expression serene despite the poisonous words being directed at her. "This woman," Mrs. Hastings continued, "this so-called Mrs. Boon has brought heathen practices into our God-fearing territory. I have seen with my own eyes the unnatural acts she performs in the darkness before dawn, speaking in tongues to plants and herbs, calling upon spirits to aid her in corrupting the natural order." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Morrison made no effort to quiet it. Clearly, he was enjoying the theatrical nature of the proceedings, relishing his role as the arbiter of moral purity in a community that had granted him far more power than any one man should possess. Furthermore, Mrs. Hastings's voice rose to a near shriek. "This woman has bewitched not only her husband, but also the innocent child in their care, turning them against the decent folk of this community. She speaks in foreign tongues, practices heathen rituals, and consorts with animals in ways that mock God's intended order." When she finally sat down, flushed with the exertion of her performance, Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Miss Hastings, for your courage in bringing these serious matters to the court's attention. Now, are there other witnesses who can corroborate these accusations?" Cornelius Thorne rose to his feet, his thin frame practically vibrating with malicious energy. "Your Honor, I can confirm Mrs. Hastings's testimony. I myself have witnessed this woman's unnatural behavior. She speaks to animals as if they were human beings, and they respond to her in ways that violate the natural hierarchy established by the Almighty." He paused for dramatic effect, his pale eyes scanning the courtroom to ensure he had everyone's attention. "Moreover, Your Honor, there are questions about the legitimacy of her marriage to Mr. Boon. A union that began in such irregular circumstances with a woman of such questionable character cannot be blessed by God. It is an affront to Christian marriage and a corruption of the sacred institution." More murmurs from the crowd, and Abby felt Louis tense beside her. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by their accusers or the spectators. To some, it appeared to be a loving wife calming her husband. To others, it looked like a sorceress controlling her victim through unnatural means. A third witness took the stand, Jacob Morehouse, a shopkeeper whose business had been struggling until the railroad had promised him a profitable contract if he supported their interests. His testimony was more measured than the previous witnesses, but no less damaging. "Your Honor," Morehouse said with calculated solemnity, "while I cannot speak to the specific acts of witchcraft alleged by Mrs. Hastings, I can testify to the unnatural influence this woman seems to exert over her household. The boy, Henry, was a troubled child before her arrival, withdrawn, difficult, showing signs of his savage heritage. Yet within weeks of her taking residence at the Boone Ranch, he had become devoted to her in a way that seems unnatural." He looked directly at Henry, who was sitting in the gallery with Doc Brennan and Father Miguel, the boy's dark eyes blazing with fury at hearing his Apache blood characterized as savage heritage. "Furthermore," Morehouse continued, "there are the legal matters to consider. This woman's supposed expertise in territorial law. Where would a simple Amish farm woman acquire such knowledge unless through supernatural means? Her ability to confound trained legal professionals suggests powers that extend beyond normal human capabilities." Judge Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Morehouse, that the defendant's legal knowledge is evidence of supernatural influence?" "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that when someone with no formal education consistently outmaneuvers trained professionals in complex legal matters, we must consider all possible explanations for such unlikely expertise." The implication was clear. Abby's successful defense of their property rights wasn't evidence of intelligence and careful study, but proof of demonic assistance. It was a clever attack that sought to undermine not just her character, but the very victories that had made her a threat to the railroad's interests. When the prosecution's witnesses had finished their testimony, Judge Morrison turned to Abby with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Mrs. Boon, you stand accused of serious crimes against both divine and territorial law. How do you answer these charges?" Abby rose to her feet with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the proceedings. The courtroom fell silent, everyone straining to hear how this accused witch would defend herself against the mounting evidence of her corruption. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily to every corner of the packed room. "I stand before this court as a woman of faith, a devoted wife, and a loving mother to the child you have heard disparaged here today. The accusations against me are not just false, they are an insult to every principle of justice and Christian charity that should govern our community." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Mrs. Hastings claims to have witnessed me speaking in foreign tongues to plants in my garden. This is true. I do speak Pennsylvania Dutch to my herbs, just as my grandmother spoke to hers and her grandmother before her. It is a practice rooted in love for the growing things God has given us, not in any supernatural power." Judge Morrison interrupted with a sneer. "And I suppose you have some rational explanation for why these plants respond so remarkably to your traditional methods." "I do, Your Honor," Abby replied calmly. "With the court's permission, I would like to call my first witness." Morrison looked annoyed at having his theatrical moment interrupted, but territorial law required him to allow the defense to present its case. "Very well, call your witness." "I call Dr. Samuel Brennan to the stand." Doc Brennan rose from his seat in the gallery, his weathered face serious, but his eyes kind as he looked at Abby. He was a man whose word carried weight in the community, a trained physician who had saved countless lives and whose scientific knowledge was respected even by those who might question his politics. "Dr. Brennan," Abby began, after he had been sworn in, "you have medical training from the University of Pennsylvania, is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct. I graduated in 1851 and have been practicing medicine for over 20 years. In your professional opinion, is there anything supernatural about treating plant diseases with soap and water applications?" Doc Brennan almost smiled at the simplicity of the question. "Absolutely not. Soap and water is one of the most effective treatments for fungal infections in plants. The timing of application, early morning when the air is cool and humid, maximizes the treatment's effectiveness. Any farmer with experience would know this. And the practice of speaking to plants while tending them. Well, Doc Brennan said thoughtfully, there's actually scientific evidence to suggest that plants respond positively to human attention and care. The vibrations from human speech, the regular presence of a caring gardener. These factors can indeed promote healthy growth. It's not magic, Mrs. Boon. It's simply good husbandry." Abby nodded and moved to her next point. "Dr. Brennan, you've had occasion to observe my interactions with the boy Henry. In your professional opinion, is there anything unnatural about the relationship between us?" "Quite the opposite," Doc Brennan replied firmly. "Henry was a traumatized child when he came to live with the Boons, withdrawn, distrustful, showing signs of profound grief and abandonment. Mrs. Boon's patient, loving care has helped him heal in ways that frankly impressed me as a medical professional. There's nothing supernatural about it. It's simply what happens when a damaged child is finally shown consistent love and stability." The doctor's testimony had a visible impact on the courtroom. Several spectators were nodding, and even Judge Morrison looked somewhat less confident than he had moments before. "Thank you, Dr. Brennan," Abby said. "I'd like to call my next witness, Father Miguel Santos." A surprised murmur went through the crowd as the elderly Catholic priest made his way to the witness stand. Father Miguel was deeply respected in the territory. His small mission, serving both the Mexican families who had remained after the territorial acquisition and the growing number of Catholic immigrants from back east. "Father Miguel," Abby began, "you've spoken with me on several occasions about matters of faith and Christian doctrine. In your opinion, do my beliefs and practices align with Christian teachings?" The old priest's voice was heavily accented but clear and strong. "Mrs. Boon is one of the most genuinely Christian women I have ever encountered," he said without hesitation. "Her faith is not the cold, judgmental variety that some mistake for holiness. It is the warm, active faith that Christ himself taught, caring for the outcast, defending the innocent, showing mercy to those who have been rejected by their communities." He turned to look directly at Mrs. Hastings, his dark eyes flashing with righteous anger. "The accusations brought against this woman are not born of Christian concern. They are born of fear, jealousy, and the desire to destroy someone whose goodness makes others uncomfortable with their own failings." Judge Morrison's face was growing red with anger at this unexpected challenge to his authority. "Father, you will confine your testimony to the specific questions asked." "Forgive me, Your Honor," Father Miguel replied with elaborate courtesy. "But when a servant of God sees evil masquerading as righteousness, he has a duty to speak the truth." Abby felt a surge of gratitude toward the brave old priest, but she knew she needed to move carefully. Morrison was clearly looking for any excuse to find her in contempt or to dismiss her witnesses. "Father Miguel," she continued, "in your experience, what are the signs of true witchcraft or demonic influence?" The priest considered this question seriously. "True evil reveals itself through hatred, destruction, and the corruption of innocence. It seeks to tear down rather than build up, to divide rather than unite, to destroy love rather than nurture it." He gestured toward where Henry sat in the gallery. "Look at that boy, Your Honor. When he came to live with the Boons, he was broken, afraid, convinced that he was worthless because of his mixed heritage. Now look at him, confident, loved, secure enough his place in a family that values him. Is this the work of evil, or is this the work of Christian love in action?" When Father Miguel stepped down, Abby called her final witness, Henry himself. The boy walked to the witness stand with determined steps, his young face set in lines of fierce resolve. "Henry," Abby said gently, "these people have made accusations about my character and my influence over you. I want you to tell this court in your own words what your life has been like since I came to live at the ranch." Henry looked around the courtroom, his dark eyes taking in the hostile faces of the accusers, the curious expressions of the spectators, and the encouraging nods of the few supporters scattered throughout the crowd. "Before Mrs. Abby came," he began, his young voice surprisingly steady, "I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. People looked at me like I was something dirty because of my Apache blood. I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a burden that Mr. Lewis had to put up with." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But Mrs. Abby, she never looked at me like that. From the first day she talked to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and feelings were important. She taught me that being Apache doesn't make me less than anyone else. It makes me special in my own way." Tears were beginning to form in Henry's eyes, but his voice remained strong. "She's not a witch. She's the first person who ever made me feel like I had a real home, a real family. If that's evil, then I don't understand what good is supposed to look like." The simple honesty of the boy's testimony hit the courtroom like a physical force. Even some of the railroad supporters looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they confronted the reality of what their accusations were trying to destroy. But Cornelius Thorne wasn't finished. He rose to his feet, his face twisted with malicious determination. "Your Honor, this child's testimony only proves the depth of the defendant's corruption. She has clearly bewitched him so thoroughly that he cannot see the evil that surrounds him." Henry's head snapped up, his young face blazing with fury. I'm not bewitched, you hateful man. Mrs. Abby never did anything but love me and take care of me. The only evil I see in this room is people trying to destroy a good woman because they're jealous of her happiness." "Henry," Judge Morrison said sternly, "you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom." But the boy was beyond controlling himself. Months of suppressed anger at the injustices he'd witnessed, combined with his fierce protective love for the woman who had given him a real home, finally boiled over. "You want to talk about evil?" Henry continued, his voice rising with passion. "Evil is people like you who try to tear apart families because you can't stand to see other people happy. Evil is calling someone a witch because she's smarter than you are. Evil is trying to steal people's land with fake papers and then attacking them when that doesn't work." The last accusation hit the courtroom like a bombshell. Several spectators gasped, and Clayton Reeves half rose from his seat before thinking better of it. Henry had just connected the railroad's land grab attempts directly to the witchcraft accusations, exposing the true motivation behind the charges. Judge Morrison's gavel came down repeatedly as he tried to restore order to the increasingly chaotic courtroom. "The witness will be silent," he shouted. "Any further outbursts will result in contempt charges." But the damage was done. Henry's passionate defense of his adoptive mother, combined with his astute observation about the timing of the accusations, had shifted the mood in the courtroom. What had begun as a witch trial was beginning to look like exactly what it was: a railroad company using the legal system to eliminate obstacles to their profit. Abby felt a surge of pride and love for the brave boy who had just risked everything to defend her. But she also knew that they were approaching the most dangerous moment of the entire proceeding. Judge Morrison was clearly furious at having his carefully orchestrated show trial disrupted, and desperate men often made dangerous decisions. "Your Honor," she said quickly before Morrison could escalate the situation further, "I would like to present some documentary evidence to the court." Morrison glared at her with undisguised hatred. "What kind of documentary evidence?" Abby reached into the leather satchel she'd brought with her and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. "Letters, Your Honor. Communications between various parties that I believe shed light on the true nature of these accusations." "Where did you obtain these letters?" Morrison demanded suspiciously. "They were delivered to me by a concerned citizen who believed the court should have access to all relevant information," Abby replied carefully. What she didn't say was that the concerned citizen was Judge Patterson's clerk, who had been conducting his own investigation into the railroad's activities. The letters had been intercepted through entirely legal means, but their contents were explosive. "Your Honor," Abby continued, "with the court's permission, I would like to read from a letter dated 3 weeks ago, written by Mr. Clayton Reeves to Mrs. Cordelia Hastings." Morrison looked trapped. Refusing to allow evidence would make his bias obvious, but allowing it might expose more than he wanted revealed. "Proceed," he said reluctantly. Abby unfolded the first letter and began to read in a clear, carrying voice. "Dear Mrs. Hastings, thank you for your willingness to assist the Colorado and Eastern Railroad in resolving the unfortunate situation at the Boone Ranch. As we discussed, Mrs. Boone's legal expertise has proven to be an unexpected obstacle to our development plans." A shocked murmur went through the courtroom. The letter was proving Henry's accusation that the witchcraft charges were connected to the railroad's land grab attempts. Abby continued reading. "Your suggestion that accusations of moral corruption might prove more effective than direct legal challenges is quite astute. A woman's reputation once damaged is difficult to repair, and without Mrs. Boone's influence, Mr. Boone will likely prove more amenable to our generous offers for his property." The murmur was growing louder, and several spectators were turning to stare at Clayton Reeves, who had gone pale in his front row seat. "The railroad is prepared to compensate you handsomely for your assistance in this matter," Abby read on. "As discussed, the sum of $500 will be yours once Mrs. Boon's reputation has been sufficiently damaged to neutralize her effectiveness. The courtroom erupted in shocked voices and angry accusations. Judge Morrison pounded his gavel frantically, but the damage was done. The letters had exposed the witchcraft accusations as a paid conspiracy orchestrated by the railroad to eliminate a troublesome opponent. "Order!" Morrison shouted. "I will have order in this courtroom." But order was the last thing anyone wanted to restore. The crowd was angry at having been manipulated, furious at the railroad for treating them like puppets in their corporate schemes. Several people were shouting questions at Clayton Reeves, who was trying unsuccessfully to slip out of the courtroom unnoticed. Abby waited for the noise to die down slightly before speaking again. "Your Honor, I have several more letters here, including communications between railroad officials discussing the best methods for intimidating property owners and corrupting local officials." The threat was unmistakable. Morrison understood that if those letters were read aloud, his own corruption would be exposed for everyone to see. His career, his reputation, possibly even his freedom would be destroyed. "Mrs. Boon," he said through gritted teeth, "in light of this new evidence, and considering the testimony we've heard today, this court finds that the accusations against you lack sufficient merit to warrant further proceedings." It wasn't exactly an acquittal, but it was as close as Morrison could come to admitting defeat without completely destroying himself. The witchcraft charges were dismissed, and with them the railroad's attempt to eliminate the Boon family through character assassination. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many stopped to offer Abby words of support and apology for having doubted her. Mrs. Hastings slipped away without making eye contact with anyone, her $500 apparently not worth the public humiliation she just endured. But the most satisfying moment came when Henry threw his arms around Abby's waist, his young face shining with pride and relief. "We won," he whispered against her dress. "We really won." "Yes," Abby whispered back, stroking his dark hair. "We won, but more importantly, we did it together as a family." Louis appeared beside them, his arms slipping around Abby's shoulders in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "I've never been more proud of anyone in my life," he said quietly. "The way you stood up to those people, the way you protected our family. Abby, you're the strongest person I've ever known." As they walked out of the courthouse together past the same spot where Abby had once stood alone and humiliated during the wife auction, she felt the profound satisfaction of having come full circle. Then she had been a victim with no power and no choices. Now she was a woman who had defended her family and her home against forces much more powerful than herself. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but peaceful, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just experienced. But as they crested the hill that overlooked their valley, Henry suddenly pointed toward the house. "Look," he exclaimed, "there's someone waiting for us." Sure enough, a familiar figure was sitting on their porch, and as they drew closer, they could see it was Judge Patterson, his weathered face creased in what appeared to be a satisfied smile. "Congratulations," he called out as they pulled up to the house. "Word of your victory has already reached my office. I have to say, Mrs. Boon, your handling of that situation was masterful." "Thank you, Your Honor," Abby replied as they climbed down from the wagon, "but I suspect your clerk's assistance with those letters might have had something to do with our success." Patterson chuckled. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, but I did want to share some news that might interest you. The territorial government has decided to launch a full investigation into the Colorado and Eastern Railroad's land acquisition practices. Your case has provided the evidence we needed to take action against their corruption." Louis felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Does that mean we're safe, that they won't try anything else?" "I think you'll find that the railroad has much bigger problems to worry about now than one ranch in a remote valley," Patterson replied. "But more importantly, you've proven that ordinary citizens can stand up to powerful interests and win. That's a lesson that will inspire others throughout the territory." As evening fell and Judge Patterson prepared to continue his journey, the three members of the Boon family found themselves once again gathered around their kitchen table. But this time, instead of planning for battle, they were contemplating a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. "So what happens now?" Henry asked, his young face still showing the excitement of their courtroom victory. Louis and Abby looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that had been building for weeks. The crisis had stripped away the formal politeness that had characterized their arranged marriage, revealing the deeper feelings that had been growing beneath the surface. "Now," Louis said slowly, "we build the life we want to have, together." Abby felt her heart skip at the promise in his words. Their marriage had begun as a legal necessity, but somewhere along the way it had become something real and precious. They'd fought for each other, protected each other, and built something stronger than either of them could have achieved alone. "I love you," she said quietly, the words coming from her heart, without conscious thought. "Both of you. This family we've built. It's the most precious thing I've ever known." Louis reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I love you too, Abby. I didn't think I'd ever feel that way about anyone again after Sarah died. But you've shown me that the heart has room for more than one great love." Henry grinned at the adults, his happiness at their obvious affection shining on his young face. "Does this mean we're really a family now, like forever?" "Forever," Abby confirmed, squeezing both their hands. "Nothing will ever change that." Outside, the wind was picking up again, but this time it carried the scent of rain that would nourish their crops rather than the threat of storms that might destroy them. The ranch that had been a place of grief and isolation had become a home filled with love and laughter, and in the kitchen where it all began, three people who had started as strangers celebrated the victory that had proven they were unshakably bound together, a family forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by the strength of their love for each other. The battle was over, the family had won, and the future stretched ahead of them, bright with promise and rich with the certainty that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together.